In the fourth module of the new WIDA ELD standards, we are going to talk about the process for identifying the language focus for a unit and for lesson plans. So if we think about the funnel again, we've talked about the ELD standards, we've introduced the key language uses, and now we're going to talk about language expectations, language functions, and language features. Remember, language expectations are what you will do with the language. A language function is the language you will use, for example, describe. And language features are ways that you can use language. Remember, the goal is not to pick something just for the sake of choosing a language feature or a language function. Rather, it's to look at what the students need to learn and ways that they need to use language in order for them to be successful in meeting the standards and learning the content. In the WIDA book, the grade level clusters are organized, each with a short description of the grade level. So page 41 is an example of where it would start for kindergarten. There is a snapshot of the key language uses, which we talked about in the previous module. It lists what a kindergartner can do with the 4 key language uses, or some of the ways that they can use them. The next part of that grade level cluster is a distribution of the key language uses. Where do they show up in the different WIDA ELD standards, and how prominent are they? Then for each grade level cluster, there is an overview of language expectations, functions, and features, which is a nice way to kind of remind yourself what it is that each one of those words mean when you see them in tables and graphs. And then it shows a listing of social language according to key language uses. So it will go through all 5 WIDA standards and talk about what students will be able to do. And then when it gets into the other WIDA standards, for example, language for language arts, it will have an example of the key use, in this case inform, and the language expectations, what students will be able to do, and then interpretive and expressive, which we'll talk about more later. And then it gives examples of language functions and sample language features. This is not an exhaustive list, but it is a good starting place if you're thinking about different ways that students might need to use language and things they might need to practice. Now we're going to pause the video to review the grade level organization. So you should pause the video and go to the kindergarten example, just as a way of looking and reading through to see how it's organized. That starts on page 41. You can also use the PDF as well. Now that you've unpaused and had a chance to look through the grade level clusters, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about interpretive versus expressive. If you are familiar with the older WIDA standards, the 4 modalities were spoken of a lot: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. In the updated standards, they have combined those 4 modalities into 2. Interpretive, which is receptive, meaning listening or reading, and expressive, which means productive, which is speaking and writing. The reason for this change is students should be using multi-modes of communication and not just one. So it made more sense to put them in 2 categories instead of 4. As a review of what you already looked at in the book, each grade level cluster has a breakdown and information about each language piece. The key language use in form is at the top of this kindergarten example. Then it is broken down into inform for interpretive and inform for expressive. So these are ways that students should be able to use this information if they're doing interpretive tasks or expressive tasks. Following that, it goes down into the language functions. These are common patterns of language use. So in this example, it's describe, it's introduce. And then after that, there are language features, ways in which students would need to use these language functions in order to produce or understand language. So some examples are pronouns to reference something like farmer equals they. Or if you're describing something, nouns to label visuals. Remember, this is for kindergarten, so it is grade level appropriate. Verbs to label actions like farming. So it kind of gives you an idea of how to focus in on what kind of language might be appropriate. And then you would think about, based on the task that is connected to the standard, what the students need to work on. As I said before, it shouldn't be something to just pick from. It should be based on where the students are at in their proficiency levels and what they're having difficulty with. We're going to pause the video again so that you can review another grade level cluster. You can choose elementary, the first grade cluster, second through third, fourth through fifth, or secondary, which is sixth through eighth or ninth through 12th. They can be found from pages 39 all the way to page 214. And the organization is listed here on this slide. It is a good place to bookmark, especially the grades that you will be working with, so that you can become more familiar with it. And I should note that language expectations are always listed at the top of each standard page about what multilingual learners will be able to do. So now that you've paused and had a chance to review again another grade level cluster, we're going to review one more time, not for the last time, but for this module. Language expectations articulate the language necessary for meeting academic content standards. They add more specificity to the key language uses. So if you think of the funnel, it's standards, key language uses, and then language expectations. Language functions follow that, and they're common patterns of language. And they showcase the ways students might use language to meet the purpose of schooling. Language features carry out particular language functions. So if you think about the word describe, what language features will carry out that function? How are students going to produce language around the language function of describe? And if we go back all the way to the beginning to one of our first modules, you can see a Grand Canyon example. The students the fourth grade, it's a fourth grade level or grade level cluster. The content area is the language of social studies, and the key language uses narrate. So if you look at this box, I often like to start at the right. What is a task that would elicit this feature? So the task comes first sometimes. You look at the task to figure out what language you need. Sometimes you can figure that out by writing exemplars of what you want students to produce, or looking at the summative assessments to see what language ultimately students will have to produce. But in this case, it was to write a postcard about your trip to the Grand Canyon. So that was the task. The language expectation, I'll go back to the left, was to construct language arts narratives that will, and then we move on to the function, orient audience to context, And the feature for this particular task was using adverbial and prepositional phrases last Tuesday. So that's an example of how you would use language features, functions, and expectations to help you in your lesson planning. We are not there yet. That is not what we're doing right now, but it's to give you an idea of the organization of WIDA. Another thing that is very helpful can be found on page 237, which is a great place to bookmark again, or put a sticky note. It's the collaborative planning process. It does a really nice job of using guiding questions about what you want students to learn, how they're going to be using language, and what language expectations you need to use. And so it's really useful, this 237 through 40, to think about how you would bring, if you're an EL teacher, your language expertise to the table, or if you're a content non-EL teacher, what is the content that you're trying to teach and where does language play a part in that?